For centuries, knowledge has been hidden in plain sight across the sands of time. Whispers of lost civilizations, cryptic symbols, and forbidden histories have been erased or concealed. What if the truth was never lost, but hidden? Welcome to Eye of Ancient Mysteries, where the past speaks and the future listens. Sit back, open your mind, and prepare to uncover the untold secrets of our world. Let the journey begin now. He looked at the Martian standing against the backdrop of the sky. "Stars," said Thomas. "Stars?" echoed the Martian, looking at Thomas. Bright and white, the stars shimmered through the Martian's body, as if his flesh were woven with them, like the glistening specks in the phosphorescent skin of deep sea fish. The stars flickered like violet eyes on the Martian's chest and stomach, like precious gems on his wrists. "I can see through you," Thomas said. "And I can see through you," replied the Martian, stepping back. Thomas felt the warmth of his own body and calmed himself. "Everything is fine," he thought. "I truly exist." The Martian touched his nose and lips with his hand. "I am not a phantom," he said quietly. "I am alive!" Ray Bradbury. Night meeting. That's exactly what I disagree with. Considering humans the pinnacle of nature, said Petrovsky. "That's interesting," said Parker. He raised his head and stared unblinking at Petrovsky. It was an unpleasant habit of his. "Understand me correctly," Petrovsky continued. "What I mean is that it's foolish to see ourselves as the center of the universe. We must accept the possibility that we are not the only intelligent beings, even within our own galaxy. And I'm not even mentioning the more distant parts of the cosmos. The last Martian, he was very old, so old that he no longer remembered his own name. His body still retained its strength, his eyes and hearing their sharpness, but his memory sometimes failed him. It seemed to him that an eternity had passed since he was left alone. It was a strange feeling to be the only intelligent being on an entire planet. He suffered from loneliness, yet at the same time, he felt an inexplicable and terrifying pride that the entire planet belonged to him. In time, he grew accustomed to solitude and ceased to notice it. But the pride remained, growing to incredible proportions, pushing out all other emotions. He wanted nothing, expected nothing, believed in nothing. He simply wandered ceaselessly through his vast domain, his eyes shining with a wild light. Then the humans came to Mars. He didn't want to meet them and merely smirked to himself, certain that they would never adapt. Sooner or later, they would realize this and return home. But they stayed. They built the first city in the desert, and soon a flood of settlers arrived. At first, he remained calm. The humans rarely ventured beyond the city. But then, suddenly, it was as if something had lifted the barriers that held them back. Expeditions began to push deep into the planet's interior. Settlements sprouted, and children were born. Yet that wasn't what frightened him. The true horror was something else. The humans neither noticed nor understood the traces of the great civilization that once existed here. The magnificent Martian cities, The exquisite architecture were nothing more to them than crumbling rocks with damp, dark caves. The grand roads appeared to be mere shifting sands, and the remnants of vast canals seemed like ancient tectonic cracks. They wondered where the countless dry leaves had come from. After all, there were no trees on Mars, and they burned the leaves for warmth, delighting in the rare opportunity to sit by a real fire. They scraped what they thought was mold from the walls and scrawled their names in big white letters. Earth's children played with the huge tufts of silver webbing their parents brought from the caves. Only they could hear the faint echoes of melodies as they tore the webs apart. The wind carried the fragments into the desert, burying them forever in the endless sands. For the first time in millennia, he longed to die. But he had forgotten how. He no longer wandered from city to city. He settled in the ancient Martian capital and helplessly watched as humans laid roads for their clumsy, noisy machines. He made his home in the grandest theater on the planet. But the day came when they built a road right to his doorstep. He discovered it one morning when he woke up. Desperation drove him to madness. He ran toward the humans, shouting with all his strength, "Stop! Stop!" They looked straight at him, but saw nothing. They heard nothing. A man in a dark blue jumpsuit pressed a button on a control panel, and an explosion thundered. When the smoke cleared and the shattered rock settled, the man turned to his colleague and said, "Everything's fine, Maltsev. You can move forward." "There's no need for speculation," said Parker. "Of course, we are not alone. But for now, humanity knows only one intelligent species, ourselves. So why deprive ourselves of the pleasure, at least temporarily, of considering ourselves the pinnacle of creation? I don't see any harm in that." "I'm not so sure," said Petrovsky. "First, because one day humanity may have to blush for its arrogance. And second, we must learn to accept that the universe is not measured by human standards alone. Otherwise, we may fail to recognize our fellow minds when we finally meet them." "The crimson flower! Look at that flower!" Hogan said. Damer turned. It was beautiful. He had never imagined a flower like this could exist. A small, bright red bell. What could be simpler? And yet it had such delicacy, such purity of form and richness of color. It seemed woven from air, illuminated by the first rays of dawn. Hogan was already climbing the rocky slope. "What are you doing?" Damer said. "Leave it alone. I'm taking it for my fiancée. A flower from Mars." "Now that is a gift!" "It will wither. Better to pick it just before we leave." "Maybe you're right." Hogan hesitated. "But what if it wilts before then?" Damer shrugged. "I could try to preserve it on the ship." Hogan mused. "I don't think it's the only one," Damer said. "Fine," Hogan agreed. "I'll try." He reached out with his gloved hand and gently touched the flower. The blossom trembled, shrank, and vanished. Only a wisp of blue smoke remained between his fingers. Hogan stumbled back.
"Did you see that?"
he cried. Damer nodded. He had seen something more. On the bare rock behind Hogan, An identical flower had suddenly appeared. "There's another one," he said, though he was certain it was the same one. Hogan ran over and touched the new bloom. Again it disappeared into smoke, only to reappear a few meters away. "What the hell?" Hogan muttered. "Leave it," Damer said. "It doesn't want to be taken." "Don't be ridiculous," Hogan snapped. "A flower doesn't want anything. Something else is going on." He nudged the flower with his boot, and it reappeared farther up the slope. Damer had the distinct feeling that the flower's movements were intentional. It was leading them somewhere. "Hogan, don't," he warned again. "No way. I'm figuring this out." The flower kept moving higher and higher, and Hogan stubbornly followed, leaping from rock to rock. Suddenly, a massive boulder beneath Hogan's feet shifted. He flung out his arms, struggling for balance. "Jump!" Damer shouted desperately, but it was too late. The enormous stone tipped like the lid of a colossal jar. Hogan disappeared beneath it. "Hogan!" Damer shouted. "Hogan, can you hear me?" Silence. Damer shuddered. He had felt someone's gaze on his back and suddenly turned around. There was no one there. Only the crimson flower remained in the same spot where they had first noticed it. Damer clenched his teeth with all his might, but he couldn't stop trembling. Then he turned and ran. "Oh, come now!" Parker objected indignantly. "I personally have no doubt that two intelligent species will inevitably find a way to understand each other. Besides, the idea of a human standard is nonsense. A human simply isn't capable of evaluating the surrounding world from anything other than a human perspective. If anyone should know that, it's you." The fire Maltsev stepped out of the car and slammed the door. For the first time in 2 months, he had managed to steal a day off. Now, during the period of rapid settlement on Mars, roads were needed more than ever. Real, reliable roads. Just yesterday, his team had completed the highway between the Central Spaceport and Port Dixon, and in 2 days he would have to get back to work. But today was entirely his, and he intended to make the most of it. Having lived on Mars for nearly a year, he had yet to truly see it. They said there were amazing places here. Someday he would visit them all, but today he was content with this small rocky massif. The nearest settlement was hundreds of kilometers away, so there was hope that no one else had been here yet. Maltsev opened the trunk, pulled out a tent, a supply crate, and a water container, and carried everything to the base of the nearest rock. In the shade, it was still cold, and a thin layer of frost covered the sand. His boots left clear prints on it. He looked around. At the boundary between light and shadow, the soil was dark with moisture, and pale mist rose above it. Behind a rock outcrop, he found a cave, narrow and damp, like all caves on Mars. Maltsev switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. A chill ran down his spine, forcing him to turn on the heating in his vest. The cave walls were covered in thick frost, whose prickly flakes crumbled under his steps and melted on his face. Small gravel crunched underfoot. The cave took a turn to the right. Here, There was no frost instead. The walls were slick with patches of colorful mold. Where did all these caves come from? Maltsev wondered. And why do they all look the same? Mold on the walls, gravel on the floor, and sometimes pieces of a strange web. Something rustled underfoot. Leaves, a huge pile of them. Now this was a stroke of luck, he thought. According to the first settlers, such finds were rare. Technically, they weren't leaves. There were no trees on Mars. But it was known that this was the only naturally occurring fuel on the planet. That meant he could make a fire. He hadn't counted on such good fortune. He bent down, grabbed a handful of dry, brittle leaves, crushed them in his palms, and blew away the fine dust. Back in the dawn of civilization, the Martian Iliad had been created. Generations of literary scholars and historians had struggled to determine its author, but they never reached a consensus. Dozens of cities vied for the right to be called the birthplace of the great poet. Thousands of Martian writers studied the epic, striving for its depth of imagery and unfading vibrancy. Yet only a few managed to reach its level of mastery. Before dawn, he packed his belongings into the car, checked if he had forgotten anything, and only then shook out the reserve of leaves from his sack. They ignited the moment he held a lighter to them. The tongues of flame leaped from leaf to leaf, curling them into dense black tubes. Within a minute, the entire pile was ablaze, crackling and stretching toward the dark sky, scattering thousands of sparks. Maltsev squinted, feeling the gentle warmth seep through his clothes, creeping over his body in faint waves. What a strange creature man is, he thought. Is there another being in the entire universe that loves fire as much as we do? The fire flickered one last time and died out, leaving behind a heap of ashes with glowing embers within. That's it, Maltsev thought. My break is over. From the car, he couldn't see the gust of wind sweeping in from the desert, lifting the ashes and scattering them far and wide. That's true, Petrovsky agreed. However, it is still possible to imagine a world where the development of intelligence, due to the specifics of the environment, follows a path completely different from Earth's. Of course, we can't picture every detail, but we can at least derive general principles to understand how much the evolution of intelligence depends on its surroundings. Otherwise, we risk overlooking an alien intelligence simply because, from our perspective, it doesn't even constitute life, let alone reason. The toy, "Give me your hand," Scott said, but Dryden only shook his head, continuing to step away from the pit. Finally, he stopped. "No, Richard," he said. "You're a dead man. I can't help you. No one can help you anymore, and you know it." Scott cursed viciously. His hands were already turning blue, his nails glowing like lapis lazuli. "Go," he rasped. "Go now. Leave me alone." Dryden nodded, never taking his eyes off Scott's hands. "Get out!" Scott exploded. "That's the least you can do." Dryden gathered the scattered equipment and shifted uneasily on his feet. "Do you want me to tell anyone anything?" he asked guiltily. "No, just go." "I'm sorry," Dryden said, and quickly walked away through the dunes. Scott didn't answer, but his eyes were filled with nothing but hatred. He waited until Dryden disappeared from view, then pulled his blaster from its holster with a numb hand and set it down at the edge of the pit. Dryden was right. When someone fell into the clutches of the sure death, there was no hope left. The only thing to do was summon all the courage one had left and die with whatever dignity was possible under such circumstances. He knew this well, but still, he couldn't help but curse Dryden, though there was no reason to. But who could have held back? He even felt guilty, though in this case, guilt was meaningless. He had just been lucky. It could have been the other way around. Then Scott would have been the one walking away, leaving his doomed friend behind. He tried to move his legs, but could no longer feel them. Maybe they didn't exist anymore. Transformed into blue jelly. The pit's edge was still at his eye level, though he felt no pain. His body was numb, barely responding. Should he wait, or should he end it now? Many in his position had done just that, but a mad hope held him back. He smiled and placed his hand on the blaster's grip, only to withdraw it immediately, afraid he might give in to temptation. He began thinking of Earth, kind, warm Earth, where you could walk anywhere without the risk of falling into the foul nest of an azure creature, where the sun was gentle and the air was thick enough to drink. He had known what he was getting into when he came to Mars. It was the danger that had drawn him here. The pit's edge shuddered and began to rise. It's starting, he thought. The glowing blue jelly engulfed his head. A pulsating bulge formed, changed color, and split into petals, radiating all the hues of the rainbow. A monstrous, terrifyingly beautiful flower. A moment later, it wilted, darkened, and vanished. The jelly filled the pit and solidified. The wind took care of the rest, burying it beneath the sand, erasing all traces of Mars' deadliest trap. The Martians, just like humans, loved their children very much, and their children, like those on Earth, were mischievous and loved games more than anything else. Of course, these games were meant for the older children. The youngest ones, however, found endless joy playing in the sand, just like their earthly counterparts. They even had little buckets, not exactly like those on Earth, but similar. All it took was for a child to throw a handful of sand into the bucket, and it would produce an extraordinarily beautiful color. Even the adults couldn't resist the temptation, and sometimes, in their free moments, joined in the children's games. Left to their own devices, the buckets gradually changed. They began luring animals and devouring them. Soon, there was no living creature left on the planet. But the buckets adapted once again, this time by falling into a state of dormancy. And then the humans arrived. Parker laughed. "My dear colleague," he said, "I didn't expect you to have retained so much of your childlike imagination. Let's assume you are right. Let's assume we have created a model of another world. But what is its value? Where is the guarantee that we will encounter exactly such a world and be able to use our advantages?" The lonely wind, for just a moment, it lay down among the sand dunes, pressing gently against their swelling slopes. Then, having rested, it soared onward. It circled the planet by day, under the cold rays of the sun, and by night, under the faint light of its 2 moons. It swept over the poles, lifting snowy dust, and then returned to the equator, mournfully drifting through the empty houses, as if searching for someone. It did not know that it would never again get the chance to play with the thick hair of young Martian girls or tug playfully at the edges of their wide, festive robes. It was only a wind, and to the humans who had arrived on the planet, it made no difference whether they were its old inhabitants or new ones. To the wind, everything seemed to be as it had always been. But to the humans, the wind was too dry and biting. They hid from it in their metal homes, and if they went outside, they put on their spacesuits. The Martians had never done that. They had breathed it in deeply, caught it with open arms, and laughed joyfully when it caressed their faces. Humans were completely different, and sometimes when the wind grew stronger, they feared it. But the wind was only wind, and it bore them no grudge. To it, nothing had changed in this world. It circled over the poles, returned to the equator, and rushed furiously through the deserted streets of the cities. It was all the same to the wind. It did not even know how lonely it had become. The voice, the coarse sand crunched underfoot like snow. Vogel closed his eyes and imagined himself walking across a vast snowy field, squinting against the glare of the sun. At the field's edge, he could almost see pine trees swaying, dissolving into multicolored spots in his teary eyes, filling the air with the crisp scent of cold and snow. He sighed and opened his eyes again. His vision had adjusted to the darkness, and now he could make out the rounded slopes of the dunes, barely visible against the almost black sky. There were no stars. Such a thing was exceptionally rare on Mars. After great sandstorms, when thousands of tons of fine dust floated in the atmosphere for days, even the daylight resembled twilight. Vogel turned toward the abandoned rover, but it was no longer visible. 8 kilometers remained to Fort Equator, and he had to walk for the rest of the night. It was something unusual and thrilling. Vogel did not regret for a moment that he had forgotten to check the fuel before setting off. Tomorrow, of course, he would have to come back for the vehicle, enduring Ponomarenko's reprimands. But that was tomorrow's problem. Vogel was a great lover of new experiences, though he would never admit it, even to himself. But this passion had undoubtedly played a significant role in bringing him to Mars. Colonizing Mars was 100 times harder than exploring the most remote regions of Earth, yet there was no trace of romanticism in it. Every step was carefully planned in advance, according to the long-term colonization project. There was no room for adventure. That was why Vogel saw this unexpected turn of events as a gift from fate, a kind of compensation for his unmet expectations. He recalled the many legends woven around the planet, and with some inner tension, hoped that at least one of them would turn out to be true. You just have to believe, he told himself, believe firmly and unshakably, and something is bound to happen. Just recently, Maltsev had told him about the wind's voice. On Mars, the wind was silent, but sometimes, on the longest and darkest nights, it began to speak in an incomprehensible and, as some claimed, meaningful language. Its stretched out words echoed as if they were falling from above, sending chills down the spines of those who heard them. Several people had experienced it, and they all agreed this was more than just a natural phenomenon. Someone had even tried to record it, but no sound was captured on tape. That had led to an official statement that the voice was merely a psychological illusion caused by exhaustion. But no one, except the most stubborn skeptics, believed that explanation, and so the legend remained, growing over time with new details. Vogel reached the top of the dune and stopped to catch his breath. Walking through the soft sand was no easy task. His legs felt heavy and stiff. He lay on his back and relaxed. The black sky seemed so close, as if he could touch it just by lifting his hand. He did exactly that, stretching his open palm upward, but felt nothing except the light touch of the wind. The sand flows through the fingers of the wind. Half-forgotten verses surfaced in his memory. Had he spoken them aloud? Vogel listened. Sand flows through the fingers of the wind. He whispered again, barely hearing his own voice. The words faded on his lips, disappearing almost before they were born. The Martians and their children, the Martians, much like humans, loved their children dearly. And their children, just like those on Earth, were mischievous and loved playing games more than anything. Of course, their games were meant for older kids. The youngest ones, however, delighted in playing in the sand, just like their earthly peers. They even had little buckets, though not exactly like those on Earth. A child needed only to throw a handful of sand into their bucket, and it would release an extraordinarily beautiful color. Even the adults couldn't resist the temptation and sometimes joined in the children's games during their free time. Left to their own devices, the buckets gradually changed. They began luring in small creatures and consuming them. Soon, there were no living beings left on the planet. But the buckets adapted yet again, this time by falling into a dormant state. And then the humans came. Parker laughed. "My dear colleague," he said, "I never expected you to retain so much of your childhood imagination. Let's assume you're right. Let's assume we've created a model of another world. But what is its value? Where's the guarantee that we'll encounter such a world and be able to use our advantages?" The lonely wind for just a moment. The wind lay nestled among the sand dunes, gently pressing against their swelling slopes. After a brief rest, it took off again. It circled the planet during the day under the cold rays of the sun, and at night, in the faint glow of its 2 moons, it swept over the poles, lifting clouds of snow, then returned to the equator, mournfully weaving through the deserted streets, as if searching for someone. It did not know that it would never again play with the thick hair of young Martian girls, never again teasingly tug at the edges of their flowing ceremonial robes. It was just the wind, and to it, The humans who had arrived on the planet were no different from its previous inhabitants. To the wind, it seemed as though nothing had changed. But for the humans, it was too dry, too sharp. They hid from it inside their metallic homes, and if they ventured outside, they donned their space suits. The Martians had never done such a thing. They had inhaled the wind deeply, caught it in their outstretched hands, and laughed when it caressed their faces. The humans were entirely different, and sometimes when the wind grew stronger they feared it. But it was only the wind. It did not take offense. To it, nothing in this world had changed. It circled over the poles, returned to the equator, raced furiously down the empty streets of the cities, and cared for nothing at all. It didn't even realize how lonely it had become. The coarse sand crunched underfoot like snow. Vogel closed his eyes and imagined himself walking across a vast snowy field, squinting against the dazzling reflections of the sun. At the far edge of the field, pines swayed, dissolving into multicolored blurs in his tear-filled eyes, and the crisp air smelled of cold and snow. He sighed and opened his eyes again. His vision had adjusted to the darkness, and now he could make out the rounded slopes of the dunes, barely visible against the almost pitch-black sky. There were no stars. Such an event was extremely rare on Mars. It only happened after great sandstorms when thousands of tons of fine dust lingered in the atmosphere for days, making even daytime resemble dusk. Vogel turned toward the abandoned rover, but it was no longer visible. Fort Equator was still 8 kilometers away. He had to walk the rest of the night. It was unusual and thrilling. He did not regret, even for a moment, that he had forgotten to check the fuel before setting off. Of course, tomorrow he would have to come back for the vehicle and endure Ponomarenko's scolding. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Vogel had always been a seeker of new sensations, though he never admitted it, not even to himself. But this passion had undoubtedly played a significant role in bringing him to Mars. Colonizing Mars was 100 times harder than exploring the Earth's uncharted regions, and there was not even a trace of romanticism in it. Every step was meticulously planned according to the Mars colonization program. There was no place for adventure. That's why Vogel viewed his unexpected situation as a gift from fate, a compensation for his unfulfilled hopes. He recalled the many legends about the planet and waited, with quiet anticipation, for at least one of them to prove true. He just needed to believe, he told himself. Believe firmly and unshakably, and something was bound to happen. Not long ago, Maltsov had told him about the wind's voice. On Mars, the wind was silent, but sometimes, during the longest and darkest nights, it would begin to speak incomprehensible yet seemingly meaningful words. Stretched out phrases fell as if from above, sending chills through those who heard them. A few people had reported hearing the voice, and all agreed it was more than just a trick of nature. Someone had even attempted to record it, but no sound was captured, leading to an official declaration that the phenomenon was merely psychological, caused by exhaustion. Only the most rigid skeptics believed this explanation. The legend persisted, growing richer with new details over time. Vogel reached the top of a dune and stopped to catch his breath. Walking through the soft sand was far from easy. His legs felt like lead, stiff and sluggish. He lay down on his back and relaxed. The black sky felt so close, as if he could touch it just by reaching out. He did exactly that, stretching out his open palm, but felt nothing except the faint touch of the wind. The sand flows through the fingers of the wind. Half-forgotten verses surfaced in his memory. Had he spoken them aloud? Vogel listened. The sand flows through the fingers of the wind. He repeated slowly, his voice barely audible, fading as soon as the words left his lips. "I have to keep moving," Vogel said, but his words seemed to dissolve as if swallowed by a vacuum, or muffled by cotton. He started descending the dune. Unknowingly, his pace quickened. The loose sand slid beneath his feet, making it hard to keep his balance. "Am I scared?" he thought. "Nonsense. It's just the thin air. Hey!" he called out, but no sound came. His voice escaped as an unintelligible murmur, something he sensed more than heard. "What's happening?" he thought, and to his own surprise, he began running, stumbling in the sand, flailing his arms. A loud noise, like thunder, stopped him in his tracks. "What was that?" he whispered, and then he heard the voice. Its unintelligible words fell rhythmically, heavily, like drops from above. Echoes carried them across the landscape, then bounced back, layering on top of themselves like waves, ringing loudly in his ears. "What is this?" Vogel mouthed in silence and collapsed onto the sand, clutching his head. But the voice went on. It told a story in a tone devoid of emotion, and though Vogel understood none of it, the sound was unbearable. He rose to his knees, looking up with hatred. "Enough! Enough!" he thought. "I can't take it any more." A sudden gust of wind threw a handful of sand into his face. As he rubbed his eyes, the voice fell silent. The ensuing silence was deafening. With difficulty, he got to his feet and ran. 2 hours later, tiny lights appeared on the horizon, the lamps atop Equator's dome. Vogel sobbed and collapsed onto the sand. His eyes burned, his mouth was dry, and he could feel the grit of sand grinding between his teeth. Dawn was approaching. "The Martian monument, your words remind me of one of Baron Munchausen's stories," Parker said, smiling. "The one where he pulled himself out of a swamp by tugging on his own hair. In my opinion, all human attempts to transcend the limits of their inherent perceptions and logic will end in a similar paradox. It's not about reshaping human thinking." Petrovsky replied, "Such a thing is probably impossible and unnecessary. If that were the case, humans would cease to be human. But I believe that all forms of intelligence should have at least one common touchpoint, a foundation for mutual understanding, something we need to learn to identify." Parker smiled again. "Let's not argue," he said, leaning forward and picking up his glass. "For a moment, let's forget about science and talk about purely human things." Petrovsky did not respond. "Don't be offended," Parker continued. We won't have to wait long for our dispute to be resolved. Perhaps we will even live to see the day, to the wonderful future." He raised his glass and winked unexpectedly. "And it will tell us who's right." The monument to the Martian. After the designated period, poets appeared on Mars. As the harsh pioneers were replaced, the poets arrived to describe their real feats and create legends about deeds that had never actually occurred. This had happened on Earth, and the same was repeated on Mars. Poets were prone to seeing things a little differently than ordinary people, and for this reason, they saw what no one had seen before. When a young writer penned a fantastic poem in which he depicted Mars inhabited by strange, intelligent creatures, everyone embraced it with enthusiasm. Written convincingly, it made readers believe that such a world could exist, and this was the very reason for the poem's success. A talented book can make us believe in anything. This was the young author's first major poem. It was followed by others. Many years passed, and when the poet died, he was hailed as one of humanity's greatest geniuses. Monuments were erected to him on all the colonized planets, and on Mars they built a memorial complex, for it was here that he had spent much of his life and written his most significant works. A monument was also erected to the Martian, the hero of the poet's first book. They placed it in the most prominent spot in the new Martian capital, on a rock that, for reasons unknown, had never been lifted into the air and had remained standing in the city. The multi-meter statue, made of stainless steel, depicted a massive, awkward creature with a very large head, enormous eyes, and a crooked nose. The Martian stood with its short legs spread wide, gazing at the sprawling city below. Some found the expression on its face to be confused, and they didn't like it, because the Martians described by the poet were cold and emotionless beings. But despite everything, the monument soon became a local landmark, and according to the general opinion of tourists, it greatly enhanced the capital. It was no accident that it was created by the most famous sculptor on Mars. At his insistence, dozens of powerful spotlights were placed around the rock, illuminating the monument at night. The Martian gazed at the city, and in its round eyes one could indeed read confusion. The city below it was foreign to it. It could not recognize its native planet, transformed by human hands, and most importantly, it could not recognize itself.